Hello and welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod, which is the epicenter of cutting edge ideas and thinkers from around the world. We are here to discuss a topic which has been provocatively titled The Forgotten Battlefield, the Fight for Development. And the speakers that I have with me today are really three people who are at the forefront of this battle, I would say. We have Hari Menon, India Country Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ayode Alakija is co-chair African Union's African Vaccine Delivery Alliance. And Ode Darnall is research analyst and project manager at the Stimson Center. Welcome to the Ideas Pod.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, just a way to introduce the topic a bit. At the annual UN meeting in New York last year, there was one message that came out loud and clear, that progress on sustainable development is seriously off track. And that is not surprising, given that the world has been in the midst of one crisis after another, from the pandemic to climate change to war and conflict, and of course, rising debt in developing countries. And as the deadline for Agenda 2030 approaches, we need a new consensus for development. How can the world find new ways to cooperate amidst rising polarisation and conflict among nations? And that is what we're exploring today. I'm going to dive deep into this debate right off and begin with you, actually. The divisions between the global north and south have sharpened since the pandemic. And of course, with the fuel and food supplies being hit since the Ukraine war, those have become even more deeply entrenched. How do you think the global north and south can find ways to still work together and prioritize development?
Trust. And you're quite right. Trust has been fundamentally fractured. I think global trust is fundamentally fractured. How do we work together? The answer is we must work together. The how is going to be a whole lot more difficult. You reference COVID and the pandemic. You reference the inequities that were brought so sharply into focus during that. You also reference the Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war. I would add to that now the war in Gaza, and look today at what's happening at the International Courts of Justice, where South Africa has brought this case forward. The world is so divided at this moment. I don't think we've ever been as divided since the 1930s. The very reasons for which multilateralism came about, for which the UN structures, the Bretton Woods institutions were created, 70 odd, 80 odd years ago, those reasons have now come to the fore, but the battlegrounds are no longer Europe. The battlegrounds are Asia. The battlegrounds are Africa. You talk about rising debt. My own country, Nigeria, just today, we've just seen the most incredible crash in currency, where our currency has fallen to levels never before seen. The world is in a precarious place. And we're now beyond just talking about whether the global south and the global north can work together. The axis of world power is shifting. We need a new world order. And it's not who is the global north or who is the global south. I really love something that Dr. Jaishankar said. We were at the UN at UNGA in September last year when he said, when you're the global south, you know that you're the global south. Nobody needs to tell you. But this time for division is over. This time for who is in the south and who's in the north is over. We need to remember that we are a common humanity, and we're going to lose that common humanity. We're going to lose it with the rise of digitalization and AI. And, I saw today neural chips being implanted in mice brain. We as humans are losing what it means to be human. And, how do we work together to bring ourselves out of this mire is up to political leadership, political will. But I also firmly believe it is up to the youth of the future, because I think our generation in many ways have lost it. We somehow have lost it in the middle. And I think we have to look to development of young people. And that brings me to something you and I were discussing earlier, the Nigeria-India bridge, bringing young people together. We can talk about that later. But I firmly believe that in this critical moment that we're in, we have to take a deep look inside ourselves as a global community. We have to recognize that our children and our grandchildren's future is at risk. And we have to recognize we need to make really difficult decisions, difficult choices. And it doesn't matter who's right or wrong anymore. What matters is the future. How do we work together? It's not a very simple answer, but we have to find a way to breach the broken trust. And that trust is so deeply fractured that we are walking across the road metaphorically from one another. You know, just as during COVID, people would avoid one another. What that did was it made us inherently suspicious of our brother, our sister, you know, because that's who we are, brothers, sisters, Asia, Africa, America, Europe. We are brothers, we are sisters, but the world has forgotten that. How? The question is not how we work together, therefore. The question is how do we rebuild that trust? How do we come together again as a global community?
That gives me the segue to ask you. You spend a lot of your time thinking about all of these issues. How do you think trust can be rebuilt, and how can we rise above the geopolitics of it all?
Thank you for this question. And I think actually my answers really will follow up on that question of the trust. I think that the first step to build this trust is to acknowledge the fact that the world order doesn't work. And it has never worked for the majority of the world. And even though today we know that we have these divisions, that the SDGs are far from being reached, somehow there's still strong pushback against acknowledging the fact that the international system does not work. The multilateral organizations have favored a minority, while the majority has been marginalized from the international decision-making bodies. And I think that's, and especially, you know, being based in DC, I think that we can hear that very strongly. There are obviously the geopolitical tensions with that great power competition and those tensions between China, Russia, and the United States. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that this also moves away the focus from the urgency. As you mentioned, the fact that we need to come together to think about the solutions, to think about how to address the climate peril, for instance, how to address the debt crisis, the food crisis, the security crisis that so many countries face around the world. And I think that we really need to get this first step, to acknowledge the fact that no, the world system has never worked. And the demands that we hear today from the Global South are not new. They've been around since the decolonization movements. And we need also to underline this. So the challenges that we see are more acute. Many of them are not new, and same for the demands. And so I think we really need to go back to that fundamental idea and recognition that this world order needs to be changed, it needs to be reformed. And so just as you mentioned, overcoming the geopolitical tensions is also about acknowledging the fact that, as our colleague just mentioned, the different perils and emergencies that we face need collective actions, and just not one or another country will be able to address them by themselves. And so we need the international community to get together to address those.
Thank you. Hari, my question to you, in fact, takes off from some of what Oud has just said, which is the question of the reform of global financial architecture and the need of it. We bring it up in every such forum now. How do you think we can concretely achieve that and make it fit for purpose for the Global South?
Thanks, Sunaina. I wish that were an easy problem to solve. And I think, as Yodi said, the trust element is what is critical if we are to come up with a fit for purpose architecture for the future. I think the challenge we have is, there were a set of institutions that were developed in the aftermath of, the Second World War, which were probably right for that time. And now we have those same institutions which have a certain way of functioning, a certain power balance in place, trying to deal with a very different world. And there is no way we can prepare for the future if the needs and interests of the poorer countries are not given the primacy that they really require. And by primacy, I mean in a way where they get to decide their priorities, and then the global financial architecture comes in to serve that, as opposed to serving up a menu for the poorest countries. And I think, unfortunately, that is how the current architecture still functions. I mean, there have been successes. So I think the role of institutions that have worked, many of the MDBs, for example, have contributed to very significant poverty reductions. Countries like China, Indonesia, India all benefited from MDB lending. But now we have a very different set of problems to solve for. And I think to get there, there are, 2 or 3 things that we need to focus. One is, like I said, making sure that the poorest countries get to design the financial architecture for their needs, and their leaders and their people have the voice and the agency to do so. That is going to require some of the established powers making way for other voices to come in. And that is going to mean giving up some of the power that you've had. And absent that shift happening, I don't know that we're going to come up with a better future. The second, I think, is we need additional financing. Talking as new problems emerge and priorities shift, we are often seeing countries and governments making promises but not backing it up with new money. So what that does is really shift resources away from priorities and issues that have not yet been solved. Many parts of the world, many countries still need to fix fundamental issues like education and health. And you can't take money away from that to focus on the next new problem. So we do need the better off countries, the richer countries, to put in new financing. I think one of the strongest signals the world can send that we are ready for the future is by making sure IDA 21 succeeds and is fully resourced, because IDA is probably the best performing instrument that we have in the global financing architecture to drive equitable development, right? And so making sure that IDA financing is successful, and the funding that's needed for that comes in. That's the second piece. The third, and Yodi mentioned this, so did Odd, the mounting debt burdens. We are actually living in a time where, there's a lot of obsession with, is the US going in for a soft landing or a hard landing and implications, etc. I think people are missing out what's happening in some of the poorer countries. I mean, to take sub-Saharan Africa, which still has 60% of the poorest people in the world, economic growth this year is likely to be 1.2% at best. And at that level of growth, you're probably going to see poverty rates increasing. You've seen bilateral aid to sub-Saharan Africa declining in the last couple of years, post-COVID, at a time when that assistance has never been needed more. And then, the debt servicing costs. I think the common framework needs to be revisited. We need much swifter resolutions for the debt burdens that LICs and LMICs currently are dealing with. The kind of speed that you've seen coming out when, say, a Silicon Valley bank failed, we are able to come up with swift resolutions for that. Countries get focused on those kinds of issues. This is a bigger challenge and a bigger tragedy that's unfolding, because it's touching hundreds of millions of people, billions of people in some ways, and yet the urgency seems to be lacking. So you're still seeing debt restructuring take 2, 3, 4 years to resolve by when the ground realities have shifted. So we need a lot more, rapid action. So I think those are the 3 priorities if we want to come up with a financial architecture for the future.
Okay, hold that thought. I'm going to come back with a follow-up question. Yodi, he just talked about sub-Saharan Africa and rising debt, and so did you. And of course, Africa also has committed to Agenda 2063. So we're talking about Agenda 2030 and the AU's agenda. How geared is Africa to meet these challenges, and keeping in mind that we are basically discussing the decolonization of multilateral institutions, and Africa really is at the heart of this initiative?
Thank you. I don't like to use the term decolonization because I find that it gives some people hives. It makes people nervous. So, I think it reminds them too much of what their forefathers did, and it makes them jiggle in their chairs. So I use the term the rebalancing of power. Let's rebalance power. So let's talk now about rebalance. That also makes people uncomfortable, but what the heck? let's rebalance power here. Look, when you talk about, I want to speak a bit to what Harry said as well. You talk about, Africa's Agenda 2063. First of all, I don't work for the African Union. I want to make that very clear. During COVID, I was appointed by the Bureaus of Heads of State to lead the Vaccine Delivery Alliance. I don't work for the African Union in any capacity, so I can speak very freely. And this is not a talking point. Africa is not going to meet any of those goals. Because to meet any of those goals, the things that Harry's just referred to in terms of debt, in terms of servicing of debt, but I will add one more to that, actually, Harry, also governance. With any of this, debt servicing, development goals, meeting goals, it all requires good governance. We have a situation where the world is falling even more and more into the haves and the have-nots. And unfortunately for my continent, Africa, I'm a proud Nigerian. I tell people all the time, people say, oh, you sound so British. I say, well, that is an effect of colonization, but unfortunately, I am very, very much a proud Yoruba girl from Nigeria. And poor governance, unfortunately, which is very much supported by those who would want to see us remain poor, broke, busted, and disgusted. Because when you see powers that be from the West supporting certain leaders who are despots that they would never tolerate in their own countries, you wonder why. And then you look under the ground and you find the minerals and you find the deposits, you find the oil, and you find that the weaker a leader is in an African country, the better it is for the world to rape and pillage. It has become a different form of colonization. It has become a different form of exploitation. We're now exploiting through governance. We're exploiting through so-called democracy. We're exploiting through imposing our own ideas and our ideals upon a people who are already downtrodden. And therefore, that is our second, extraction. So no, Africa, unfortunately, my beloved Africa, is not going to meet those goals. And let's just call it like it is today. There's no amount of money that is poured into a continent that is so fractured. If you look at West Africa, what is going on with ECOWAS at the moment, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, all these countries, and Niger, Guinea was yesterday actually, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso was the week before. It shows you how rapidly things are, the pack of cards is tumbling. Those countries extricated themselves from the Western bloc of ECOWAS. They have been taken over by military rulers. People would say democracy has failed in those countries, but has it? Is it democracy that has failed, or is it that power in a way has been rebalanced because they have removed power from the lack of checks and balances and accountability that they can see? And as a younger generation, I'm in no way condoning coups or condoning military action, but we have to look at the cause and we have to look at the effect. So before we can make these grand pronouncements about Agenda 2030 for the SDGs or 2063, we have to look at what is behind it. We have to look at what is pushing this. Harry talked about debt servicing. You cannot service debt and also the speed. I also want to remind you of Operation Warp Speed in the US during COVID. Why did we have Operation Warp Speed? Why did we have those vaccines, those diagnostics, those treatments so quickly? Because we had a disease that affected not just me and you, the poor, the brown, the haves or the have-nots, the colored or the not-nots. It was a disease that affected everybody and primarily people in the Western world. So we have speed and warp speed when it affects them, but we don't have speed or warp speed when it affects us. And that is why the we on the other end of that equation have to stand up. I speak a lot about South-to-South collaboration and South-to-South cooperation. It is time for us to come together and understand that until we, those of us from the South, devise our own methods of a warp speed, because it is, you talk about the multilateral institutions and how we rebalance power. It is when those institutions are failing that they remember to put a brown person on top in charge of them. It's what they do to us women all the time. When an organization or institution is failing, and say, ooh, it's a time for a woman. So that when it falls, then they say the woman did it. So unfortunately, no, Africa, to my mind, with its current trajectory, cannot. And until we have a youth revolution in Africa, not just invest in youth, but we have a paradigm shift and a revolution of young people on that continent. Unfortunately, the entire world is not going to meet the agendas that the world that are being set for it.
You make such an impassioned case for South-South cooperation. I know, Oud, that the program that you work on or have just launched at the Stimson Center seeks to promote the Global South in international affairs. In very practical ways, how do you do that?
So thank you very much. So the Global South in the World Order project that I launched a year ago at the Stimson is the first think tank platform in DC that is specifically geared towards elevating experts from across the Global South. So from the papers, the panels, the speakers, it is really a project that is for those experts that are generally underrepresented in international policy and in Washington in particular. I am from the Caribbean, I'm from Martinique, and I moved to DC less than a year ago. I was working remotely until then, and I was attending meetings, and quite often I was the only non-white person in the room, or we were also having meetings on the Global South, and we were perhaps 2 or 3 people coming from the Global South in the room. And so I really wanted to address that underrepresentation, but also to address the gap between the perceptions in DC and the West, generally speaking, and the realities in the Global South. And so that was my contribution to that. And so I'm very proud of the project, of the work that we've been doing. We tackle issues from global health to security crisis, to the climate financing issues. And every time, you talked about critical minerals. Well, if we have a topic on the panel on the critical minerals, we will have people coming from Indonesia to talk about the issue from Indonesia perspective, from Chile to talk about the issue from the Chilean perspective, from South Africa. So that's really the goal of this project.
Okay, so Hari, my last question to you is something we were talking about before we started this conversation, which is how can philanthropies be more adaptive to emerging challenges and also support developing nations?
Sure, thanks, Sunaina. So I'll speak a bit about, our perspective as the Gates Foundation and how we think about our role, and then I'll speak briefly about, what the broader philanthropy ecosystem could do. But before I start, I think the reason I feel optimistic that philanthropy has a role is because wealth generation in the countries we are talking about that need to solve their own problems, that is on the rise. And my hope is, that philanthropy, which is local, rooted in an understanding of, what countries need, will emerge as even more sensitive to supporting the development needs, in a particular context. In India, we're already seeing that with more and more Indian philanthropy stepping up and focusing their efforts and their funding on, local priorities. And they don't need to be told, hey, here is how India works, here's how India operates, here's what India really needs. Whereas any global organization coming in usually needs to go through that process of, almost localization or homologation, right? And some do that effectively, others don't. So I think the emergence of local philanthropy in countries, and again, we won't say global south, but in the countries that need this kind of support the most, I hope that will continue. Now, in terms of how philanthropy can contribute the best, philanthropy is a very heterogeneous space. So I don't think there's any one prescription I can say, here's how philanthropy ought to do it. The way we at the Gates Foundation think of our role is really trying to fix market failures and trying to address problems that governments sometimes find it difficult to solve. And we do that in 2 ways. On the market failure side, an example is the work that we do in global health R&D. Now, the technologies for any of the problems that we're trying to solve exist in the world. They're just not deployed towards solving those problems because market incentives will not drive it that way, right? The amount of money that goes into drugs for, say, erectile dysfunction or for baldness cure, that's a lot more than ever goes into coming up with new therapies for malaria or TB, because, those are diseases that kill the poorest people in the poorest countries, and markets are not set up to solve for those problems. So we see a role in, deploying our capital, which we think of as the purest form of risk capital. Philanthropic capital is not about monetary returns, it's about social returns. So it should be okay to deploy it to solve risky problems where you might fail. Warren Buffett, who has given a large portion of his wealth to the foundation, has often said, if you're not failing 95% of the time, probably not working on the right problems. So one is, taking on some of these R&D and innovation challenges and deploying our capital. So, we are able to come up with solutions that can subsequently be scaled through governments, through the private sector. And kind of linked to that is also creating mechanisms, platforms, incentives to draw in the capabilities and capital of the private sector. We can do that through volume guarantees. We can do that through equity and debt instruments. And again, we've been able to do that fairly well in areas like global health, slowly doing more in agriculture. So that's one broad area where I think philanthropy can be deployed in ways that does not substitute for what governments and multilaterals should do. The second, I think, is, and linked to some of the work Odd's talking about, I think building the capacity and capabilities of institutions and organizations in countries that are trying to chart their own development agendas. So, innovation for India is probably done best by Indian institutions. So how can we work with the government of India and domestic institutions to, support strengthening their capabilities, their technical, depth, so they are able to take on that agenda. So there's a capacity building element to that, institution building element, which also I think philanthropy can do very well. And that can then benefit, government and multilateral funding that comes in later. So those are some areas. Again, a lot to be done. And like I said in my first response, philanthropy can only work if the other forms of capital, which are more sizable, the bilateral, the multilateral, those are fixed and made fit for purpose for the future.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Hari and Oud and Yodi. I could go on with this conversation, but we're out of time. And I will only leave this with the hope that the next time the session will not be titled Forgotten Battlefield, but perhaps the Conquered Battlefield, or getting there.
Yeah, we need to hope, right? We
can hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.